Hey everyone, I hope you had fun with the exercise from the previous video. It's now time to deploy our Expennies project to production. Now there are different ways you can deploy this specific app to production. You may face challenges depending on the hosting provider that you pick and how good you are with setting up servers. We do use Redis, so that's one of the requirements that you have to consider when choosing the hosting provider. Now if you're like me and don't like to manage and provision servers, then you can use a paid service to do it for you. Laravel Forge is one such service. It basically sits on top of your typical VPS provider like DigitalOcean, AWS, Vultr, and provisions the servers for you by installing and setting up everything that's needed for your PHP applications. It is tailored towards Laravel applications, but it can also host non-Laravel PHP applications. So in this video, we're going to deploy the Expennies app using Laravel Forge, which will provision the server for us on DigitalOcean. Note that this is not a sponsored video. I just want to cover another way of provisioning and deploying apps to production. I just want you to have more than one option on deploying your apps, because we already covered how to deploy apps using something like Cloudways in this series, and using Laravel Forge may come in handy later on. And as I mentioned, it does the provisioning for you, so it handles a lot of the things out of the box for you. As I mentioned, we covered Cloudways earlier in this series, and you're free to use that service or even any other service as long as it supports Redis and other requirements that are needed for our application. Now with Cloudways, you may need to do a couple of additional things. First, of course, is to install Redis, and that's pretty simple to do on Cloudways. You can do it with just the press of a button within the server management. Then you'll probably need htaccess file because Cloudways uses Apache, so you need to create the htaccess file under the public directory. You'll need to set up the proper document root to point it to the public directory and set up the Git deployment. We did most of those things in that video about Cloudways in this series, so go back to that video if you need a refresher. Slim PHP Framework provides some more information on deploying Slim apps to production. It also has information about web servers, including one for Apache, so check those out as well when trying to deploy your application to production other than using Laravel Forge. Alright, so let's continue our deployment using Laravel Forge. I already have an account and I'm logged into Laravel Forge, so just make sure to sign up with your email and you should be brought to this server management page called Servers. We're going to launch a new server by clicking this Create Server button, and it gives us a prompt where we can select our VPS provider. So we can either do custom VPS, AWS, DigitalOcean, and so on. Now I already have my Laravel Forge account connected with DigitalOcean account, so I'm going to pick the DigitalOcean and launch the server there. Now before we do that, in case you're wondering how you can connect your DigitalOcean or any other provider to Laravel Forge, you can click on this Manage Providers button, and it will take you to the server providers under the account settings, and you select the provider and you just need to add the profile name and the API token. As you can see, I've already added the API token for DigitalOcean. Now to generate the API token for DigitalOcean, simply log into your DigitalOcean account and go to API page and then generate a new token right here. As you can see, I already have a token for Laravel Forge. That's the token that you basically copy it and paste it into this API token field. Alright, so let's go back to servers. I'm going to click Create Server, DigitalOcean. We're going to keep most of these things default. We'll change server size to 512 megabytes because I think that's more than enough for our simple app. PHP 8.2 is good. MySQL 8, and database name we can change Forge to Expennies or whatever you want to name. So let's click Create Server. As you can see, it has started provisioning our server and it's providing us the server credentials. I'm going to copy these credentials to use them later. Now this is going to take about 10 minutes to provision. As you can see, it is basically doing all these things for you. It's installing PHP, Nginx, database, Redis, Memcached, and then once it's done, you'll be able to deploy your application. Now while the server is being provisioned, let's go over some of the adjustments I made behind the scenes to make deployments easier. First, I added some dependencies in our package.json file that are needed for front-end build process that may not be available globally. Then I also improved our app.php configuration file to avoid errors related to mailer, storage, and session. For example, before these session values, secure, HTTP only, and same site were hard-coded and set to true, true, and lax. But going forward, you can control it through environment variables. I also added this Boolean helper function here, which basically extracts the proper Boolean value from the environment variable. If we scroll up here to the definition of that Boolean function, we see that it simply checks the value if it's one of the truthy values. It's true, 1, string 1, Boolean true, or yes. If that's the case, using the strict comparison, then we return true, otherwise we return false. I added this because if you set the environment variable value to false, it comes back as string false, and then if you cast that to Boolean, for example, it will be cast into true and can cause some issues. Then I also added the storage driver environment variable here. So if we search storage here, we see we have storage driver, and if it's not set to anything or not provided, we are using local as the default. Otherwise, if it's set to S3, then we're using remote DigitalOcean. Now, of course, you can configure and customize this the way you wish, but since we only have these two options, I decided to keep it simple. This way, in production, we don't have to worry about setting up S3 credentials right away. By default, we can use local, and when we're ready, we can change the storage driver to S3. Now, moving on to the mailer section here, you might notice this new option here called driver. If the mailer driver is not provided, by default, we are setting it to log, and within the container bindings, we have a check here for the mailer interface. If the driver is set to log, we are returning a new mailer object that are created behind the scenes, and I'll show that to you in a second. And if it's not set to log, then we're instantiating the mailer object from the Symfony mailer package the way we were doing it before. Reason behind that is to avoid errors related to mailer and DSN and having to set up the proper mailer DSN right away as soon as the app is in production. This way you can keep the driver log by default when you first deploy your app, test it out, and before going live, then you can register for SendGrid or any other mailer service, or even have custom SMTP and configure the DSN that way. Now, if you're going to use a service like SendGrid, you will need to install a dependency for that driver, which is very simple. You just need to refer to the Symfony mailer documentation, and it contains all the drivers that it supports and the composer command that you need to run to install that specific driver package. As you can see, the mailer class simply implements the mailer interface, and it uses the local file system to dump the content of the email to a local file within the storage/mail directory. Now, of course, you shouldn't leave this driver set to log for production. Eventually, before going live, you want to have the proper mailer DSN set up. So you might want to use a service like SendGrid or MailChimp or custom SMTP and configure it properly. Alright, so that's about it on the changes behind the scenes. Let's now go back to Laravel Forge. As you can see, we're brought into our server management page, and here we can add a new site using the domain. Laravel Forge provisions the default site for us, and this is only to be used for testing purposes if you want to just make sure that your site is deployed properly. But once you're ready, you should delete the default site and add a new site here, connecting it to the proper domain. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these different sections and pages on Laravel Forge. Laracast actually has a great series on Laravel Forge if you want to dive into more details. For now, we're just going to stick with the default site, and I'm not going to connect it to the domain. If you want to connect it to domain, as I mentioned, you just need to add a new site here and adjust the DNS settings on your domain provider. Now let's click on this default site, and in here, this is where we can install our application. We're going to install Expennies using Git repository because it lives within GitHub, and in the repository we'll enter the username / the repository name. That is my username / Expennies, and the branch that we're going to deploy is going to be main, but for this lesson we're going to deploy p38 start. because that contains the changes that I made behind the scenes. We wanted to install the composer dependencies, and we need to generate the deploy key. And this is the deploy key that we have to add to our GitHub repository so that Forge has proper access to do the deployments. So let's copy this deployment key. Let's go to the Expennies repository. We'll go to settings. Then under deploy keys, we're going to add a new deploy key here and paste it and click add key. Once that's done, let's click on install repository and wait for it to install the application. Now this is not going to deploy it just yet. We still have to do a few more things before we do the deployment. Now, of course, you would need to add the deploy key to your own repository. Once the repository has been installed, we can manage the deployment in here. First, we're going to enable the quick deploy. That way, anytime the update is pushed on that branch, it's going to automatically deploy the changes. As you can see, the deploy script basically CDs into the directory. It pulls the latest from that branch from the repository and then runs the composer install to install the dependencies. Now we need to add a few more things here to run it automatically on every deployment, like run the migrations, because we may have some updates or new migrations, so that we make sure that our database is always up to date. So in here we can run PHP commands. So we'll do forge _PHP Expennies migrate, and we're going to add no interruption so it doesn't prompt us for anything. Then we also need to run the npm install and npm run build. And note that for production, we need to run npm run build and not npm run dev or npm run watch. Those are the commands for development, but for production, it's npm run build. So we'll do npm install and then npm run build. Now we also need to generate our application key. We have a command to do that, to generate the app key, which automatically adds it to the environment variable, if you remember. So we could also add that command in here. The thing is, we only want that to execute the first time on first deployment, because we don't want to get the new key on every deployment. We only want to set it for the first time. So you have a couple of options. One is you can add that environment variable manually to the environment file, or you can simply add that command in here, let it deploy the first time, generate the app key, and then remove it from here. So I'm going to add it in here for now. So we'll do forge PHP Expennies app generate key, and once we deploy it first time, we'll remove this line. Let's update that, and next step, before actually deploying, we need to create the environment file and environment variables. So let's scroll up here and we can click on edit files and edit environment file, and in here we can enter all the environment variables that we need for our app. Now I'm just going to paste in our env skeleton that we have in our repository. So the app name is going to be Expennies, the version is 1.0, debug is going to be set to false, environment will be production, db host is localhost, db user is Forge, the password is the password that we copied when we were provisioning the server, db name is either Forge if you kept it as default, or it's going to be the database name on whatever you entered. We entered Expennies, so that's Expennies in here. Mailer DSN we're going to keep blank, mailer from we're going to set to support@expennies.com. And we need to add the mailer driver here. So we'll do mailer driver set to log. App URL is going to be our application domain. Now we don't have this app connected to a domain yet, but Laravel Forge provides us the public IP that you can access the site to. So we'll do HTTP and paste in that IP. The Redis host is Redis. Redis port is 6379, and we don't have the password here, so we'll just keep it as blank. S3 key, secret region, and these variables we're going to keep them blank as well, since we don't need it currently. and we'll set the storage driver variable to blank. Once you're ready to use S3 and you fill in these values, then you can set the storage driver to S3. One other thing that we need to add here is that we need to disable the session secure flag, because we don't have the domain connected to our app and we don't have the SSL. So our sessions basically are not going to work properly on this HTTP public IP. So while we're testing stuff in production and using the public domain, we need to disable the secure flag. Once you connect the domain to your application, then you need to flip the flag to true. So for now, we'll disable session secure and set it to false. But again, once you're ready to go live and you have it connected to your domain and it has the SSL, then you switch this to true. All right, so I think we're ready to deploy. So let's save this and let's click on deploy now. And you can monitor the logs as it's being deployed. So we can go to the deployments here. As you can see, the migrations ran successfully. The app key has been generated, which means that we can go to our deploy script and remove this because we no longer need that. Let's update. And if we check the environment, we see that we have the app key added to our environment file. Now let's go back to the deployments. Next, it's running npm install and npm run build. So right now it's building our front-end assets. Once the deployment is complete, you'll see the status in here. So let's open that public IP in browser. And as you can see, it brings us to our login page, which means that our app is deployed to production. Right now, it's not connected to domain, of course, but we can still access it using that IP. So let's now try to sign up. I'm going to enter my name, email, and password. Let's click register. And we're getting application error. Let's check the logs. We'll go to Laravel Forge, scroll down, click logs. We'll select Nginx error logs. And the error message is related to Redis. Did I put in the wrong host? Let's open environment. Redis host is set to Redis. Oh yeah, this is supposed to be localhost, or basically 127.0.0.1. But I think localhost should work. So let's set localhost, save. I just copied it on what we had on our local, because in my local I had the Redis running under a Docker container and the service name for that container is Redis. That's why I had Redis host to Redis. Let's try it now. Let's go back. Let's refresh. And sure enough, that worked. Our user was registered and we redirected to the verify page, which means that we need to check the email to verify and activate the account. Now, we haven't configured our mailer DSN, so the email was actually created as a text file within the storage mail directory. So what we need to do is that we need to SSH into our server and copy that and get the activation URL from there. Now, of course, once you set up your SMTP or the proper mailing service and the proper mailer DSN, then it will go to your mailbox. But in our case, we have the driver set to log, so it's saved under the storage mail directory. Now, to SSH into the server, what we need to do is that we need to go back to the servers and we need to add the SSH key. So we need to go to the SSH keys page. Name it something like PC or whatever. The user is Forge, that's the default user, and the public key is basically your public SSH key. Now, I've already added my SSH key before, so we should be able to SSH in successfully. If you can't SSH into the server and you're getting the pub key errors, then you just need to add your public key in here. So I'm going to open the terminal, and remember we copied the sudo password, so that's where this is going to come in handy. So we'll do SSH forge at and then the public IP and hit enter. We can do ls, we have default site, let's cd into default. Now our email is within the storage/mail directory, so we'll do cd storage mail. Let's do ls, and we have that one email, and let's copy this whole email so that we can open it properly. Now currently it's .txt extension, but I changed it recently to be .eml. Now I'm going to copy this link from here and we're going to paste it in here. Let's hit enter, and sure enough, our account has been verified and we're redirected to home page. Now, of course, we don't have any transactions, so that's why everything is blank, but we can go to transactions and import transactions. We can create categories and so on. So let's actually create a test category here. Let's go to transactions. Let's import transactions. That worked. Let's go back to dashboard. And as you can see, it's working as expected. So as you can see, we've successfully deployed our Expennies project to production. Now, to make it live, like I said, you would need to connect it to domain by creating a new site and removing the default site, and you would have to adjust the DNS records on your domain provider's portal. There are plenty of guides on how to do that online and should be pretty straightforward. You would also need to set up the proper mailer DSN, whether it's through a service like SendGrid or through a custom SMTP. Just make sure that you install the correct corresponding driver depending on whatever service you use. Now, this project, of course, is missing some of the key features and is not feature complete by any means, but it is a great starting point for you to add on more things to it from what you've learned in the series. For example, one such addition could be email cron script to queue emails up and send them out using the email cron script, so it doesn't send the emails right away. You can do that by having a table that stores email messages and its status, and then email cron script that runs every minute or every 5 minutes and sends those emails out that haven't been sent. We also did not add custom error pages or custom error handling. As you saw before, we saw the Slim's default error page. Of course, it didn't contain any of the error details because we have the environment set to production and app debug is disabled, but you may want to introduce some better custom error pages with some UI. We also didn't get a chance to add unit or integration tests due to lack of time, but again, with the things we've covered in the series, it shouldn't be hard to add tests to some of the classes and methods. Alright, so this concludes this episode and this entire series. We've covered a lot in this series and it has truly been a long ride. There were some things I wanted to cover but decided to hold off because I wanted to avoid diverging too much from the main topics. So what's next, you might ask? Well, the answer to that depends on what you want to do. You can certainly take the knowledge you've gotten from this series and apply to your own projects and work. If you want to continue learning, you can move on to learning fully featured frameworks like Laravel and Symfony. So this is it. Thank you very much for watching and following along this long journey. If you've reached this far and have completed the series, give yourself a big pat in the back and be proud because that is some dedication. This series contains almost 140 videos and requires practice on the side. So you should be proud for completing it and reaching this far. So with that, I wish you best of luck. If you enjoyed the video and the series, I would appreciate if you could hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and also share it with your friends or colleagues who could benefit from the series. Thanks again, and until next time, happy coding.